Have you ever felt stuck while trying to improve your English listening and speaking skills? You sit down with a book determined to learn, but before you know it, you're bored, frustrated, or maybe even overwhelmed. Learning English shouldn't feel like a chore, and it definitely shouldn't be something you dread. But what if I told you there's a way to make learning exciting, engaging, and even fun? Instead of just reading, why not listen? Stories have the power to transport us, to inspire us, and, best of all, to teach us without us even realizing it. When you listen to stories, you're not just learning vocabulary and grammar. You're practicing pronunciation, improving your listening skills, and absorbing the natural flow of English conversation. And that's exactly what we're here to do today. Welcome to our story series, a place where you can learn English through fascinating tales that keep you hooked until the very last word. Our first story is about Lucas, a 15-year-old boy who leaves his home and embarks on an unexpected journey filled with secrets, danger, and adventure. Will Lucas survive the challenges ahead? And what lessons will he learn along the way? Stay with us and you'll find out. Part 2. The Beginning. My name is Lucas. I was 15 years old when everything changed. It all began on a warm June morning in 1577. I still remember that day vividly. The air was crisp, the sun shone brightly, and birds chirped in the distance. As I stepped outside my small family home for what I didn't know would be the last time. Our home wasn't grand, a modest cottage surrounded by fields, but it held memories of my parents, who had both passed away the year before. Since then, I had lived a quiet life, cared for by my father's closest friend, Victor. Victor, a man in his 40s with a kind smile and sharp eyes, was standing at the door as I packed my bag. He was holding a letter, one that he said had been left by my father before his death. It was addressed to someone I had never heard of, someone named Sebastian, who lived in a place called Ravencliff Castle. Victor handed me the letter with a solemn expression. "Lucas," he said, his voice unusually serious, "your father wanted you to have this letter and deliver it personally to your uncle Sebastian. It's important. He never talked about his family, but this letter proves you have a connection to them, and perhaps even a future waiting for you." I took the letter and stared at it. The parchment was old. The ink faded in places, but my father's handwriting was unmistakable. "Uncle Sebastian?" I repeated, confused. Why did father never mention him? Why am I only learning about this now? Victor hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. Your father had his reasons, Lucas. I'm afraid I don't know much myself. But I do know that this is your chance to learn the truth about your family. Though I didn't fully understand, I nodded. A part of me was excited by the idea of an uncle and a family I had never known, but another part of me was filled with uncertainty. What if my uncle didn't want me? What if this journey led to nothing but disappointment? Victor placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Don't worry, Lucas. Whatever lies ahead, you're strong enough to face it. With those words, I slung my bag over my shoulder, tucked the letter safely inside, and set off down the dirt road leading away from my childhood home. The journey was long and tiring. For 2 days, I walked along narrow paths and through dense woods. The landscapes changed as I traveled. Fields turned into hills, and the hills gave way to rocky terrain. At night, I rested wherever I could find shelter, under trees, in abandoned barns, or by quiet streams. The further I traveled, the more questions filled my mind. Why had my father left me this letter? What kind of man was my uncle? And why was Ravencliff Castle, his home, never spoken of in my family? The answers wouldn't come, and I felt an unease creeping into my thoughts. By the morning of the 3rd day, I finally reached the top of a hill, and in the distance I saw the faint outline of a large structure, a castle. It stood in a secluded valley surrounded by mist that clung to the ground like a ghostly shroud. My heart sank when I saw it. This wasn't the grand castle I had imagined. Ravencliff Castle looked old, almost abandoned. The walls were crumbling in places, the windows dark, and no smoke rose from the chimneys. Is this really where my uncle lives? I muttered to myself, clutching the letter tightly. As I approached the castle, the silence was eerie. There was no gate, no clear path to the entrance, and weeds grew unchecked around the grounds. When I finally reached the heavy wooden door, I hesitated. For a moment, I thought about turning back. No, I said aloud, shaking off my fear. Father wanted me to come here. I have to see this through. I knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the quiet air, but there was no response. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Frustrated, I began banging on the door with my fist. Suddenly, I heard the creak of wood above me. I looked up and froze. A man was leaning out of an upper window, holding a musket pointed directly at me. His face was pale and thin, his eyes sunken and wild. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice sharp. What do you want? I have a letter, I said quickly, holding it up. It's for Sebastian. My name is Lucas, and I'm his nephew. The man squinted at me, lowering the musket slightly. Nephew, you say? Is your father dead? Yes, I replied, swallowing hard. He passed away last year. There was a long pause. Then, with an audible sigh, the man said, Come in, then. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, and the dim light from the high windows barely illuminated the grand yet decaying interior. The man, who I now realized, must be my Uncle Sebastian, motioned for me to follow him. Sebastian led me to a small room with a single chair and table. He gestured for me to sit down, but said nothing. He stared at me, his expression unreadable, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Finally, he broke the silence. Let me see the letter, he said. I handed it to him. His bony fingers trembled as he unfolded it and began to read. As his eyes scanned the paper, his lips tightened and his face darkened. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his coat. You'll stay here tonight? He said abruptly. There's a room upstairs. I'll show you. Before I could ask any questions, Sebastian stood and began walking toward the stairs. Reluctantly, I followed him. As I climbed the creaking steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. When we reached the room, Sebastian opened the door, pushed me inside, and locked it behind me. The sound of the key turning echoed in my ears. Why? Is he locking me in? I thought, panic rising in my chest. The room was small and bare, with only a bed and a small window overlooking the valley. I sat down on the bed, clutching my bag. My heart was racing, and my mind was filled with questions. What had my father written in that letter? Why was my uncle acting so strangely? And most importantly, what was I really doing here? Part 3. The Journey Begins. My name is Lucas. I didn't know it yet, but my journey to discover the truth about my family was about to take a dark and unexpected turn. It began the moment I stepped out of the locked room in Ravencliff Castle. Next morning, the sound of metal keys jingling woke me from a restless sleep. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. My Uncle Sebastian stood there, his face as stern and cold as it had been the night before. Come downstairs, he said curtly. We need to talk. His voice carried an edge that made my stomach tighten. I followed him down the creaky staircase to the dining room, a vast space with peeling wallpaper and cobwebs hanging from the corners. The table, large enough to seat a dozen people, was covered in dust. At one end of it sat a simple plate of bread and a mug of water. Sebastian motioned for me to sit. Breakfast and secrets. Sebastian sat across from me, his piercing gaze never leaving my face. He watched in silence as I nibbled on the dry bread, his expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he broke the silence. Your father, Alexander, was my older brother, he began, his voice low and gravelly. He left this place many years ago and never returned. And now, here you are. His words stirred a mix of emotions in me. Why did my father leave? I asked, leaning forward. Why didn't he ever speak of you or this castle? Sebastian's eyes narrowed. That's none of your concern, he snapped. What matters now is that you're here and you have a responsibility to this family. His tone was sharp, almost accusing. I wanted to press him for more details, but something about the way he spoke made me hesitate. Instead, I asked the question that had been on my mind since I arrived. What did the letter say? Sebastian stiffened. For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he leaned back in his chair and sighed. It said that you are to remain here, he said slowly. That this castle is your legacy, but before you can claim anything, you must prove yourself worthy. His words puzzled me. Prove myself? How? Sebastian didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the misty valley below. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. There's something you must retrieve for me. In the tower at the far end of the castle, there are documents, important documents, belonging to this family. Bring them to me, and we will talk further. The suspicious task. A chill ran down my spine. There was something about the way he spoke, something that felt wrong. Still, I nodded, determined to uncover the truth. I'll get them, I said, trying to sound confident. Sebastian handed me an old, rusty key. Be careful, he said with a smirk. The tower hasn't been used in years. The stairs might be unstable. His words lingered ominously in my mind as I made my way through the castle. The halls were dark and cold, the only light coming from small, high windows. As I approached the tower, the air grew colder, and the silence was broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing on the stone floor. When I reached the tower door, I hesitated. The wood was old and splintered, and the air seemed heavier here. Taking a deep breath, I inserted the key and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase that wound upward into darkness. The danger in the tower. I stepped cautiously onto the first stair. It groaned under my weight, but it held. Slowly I began to climb, one step at a time, my hand gripping the cold stone wall for balance. The air grew damp and musty as I ascended, and the faint sound of wind whistled through cracks in the stone. Halfway up, I felt the stairs shift beneath me. I froze, my heart pounding. Looking down, I realized that some of the steps were crumbling, their edges jagged and broken. I had no choice but to keep going. As I climbed higher, the wind grew stronger, and I began to feel it on my legs. The higher I went, the more unstable the stairs became. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the tower. I looked down and saw that the step below me had broken apart, falling into the darkness below. "This isn't right," I muttered, gripping the wall tighter. Why would Sebastian send me up here? He knew this place was dangerous. When I reached the top of the staircase, I found a small, dusty room. It was empty except for a wooden chest. In the center, I approached it cautiously, kneeling to examine it. The chest was locked, but the key Sebastian had given me fit perfectly. Inside, I found a stack of old papers, yellowed with age, and tied together with string. A shocking discovery. As I picked up the papers, a loose page slipped out. It was a letter, written in my father's handwriting. My breath caught as I read the first few lines. To whomever finds this letter, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. And it also means that Sebastian cannot be trusted. My hands trembled as I read on. The letter described how Sebastian had betrayed my father, stealing from him and driving him away from Ravencliff Castle. My father had fled to protect me and my mother, vowing never to return. Beware of him, the letter concluded. He will do whatever it takes to keep the castle and its secrets. Trust no one. My mind raced. Sebastian had lied to me. He hadn't. Sent me to the tower to retrieve documents. He had sent me to die. The unstable stairs, the dangerous climb, it had all been a trap. I stuffed the papers into my bag and turned to leave, but as I stepped onto the staircase, another crack rang out. This time the step beneath me collapsed completely, and I barely managed to grab the wall in time. Using all my strength, I climbed back down, my hands and knees shaking with fear. By the time I reached the bottom, my heart was pounding, and I was drenched in sweat. I burst back into the dining room, clutching the papers, confronting Sebastian. Sebastian was sitting by the fire, his back to me. He didn't hear me enter. Without thinking, I slammed the papers onto the table in front of him. He jumped, startled, and turned to face me. "What's this?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. "You knew," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You knew the tower was dangerous and you sent me there anyway. Why? Were you trying to kill me?" Sebastian's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice wavered. I stepped closer, my fists clenched. "I found the letter, Sebastian. My father warned me about you. He said you couldn't be trusted. So tell me the truth. What's really going on here?" For a moment, Sebastian said nothing. Then, with a cold smile, he leaned back in his chair. "You want the truth?" he said softly. "Then you'd better be prepared for what comes next." His words sent a chill down my spine. Whatever secrets Ravencliff Castle held, I knew they were far darker than I had imagined. Part 4. The Dark Plot Revealed. My hands were trembling as Sebastian stared at me with his cold, piercing eyes. The truth was hidden somewhere in this crumbling castle, and I was determined to uncover it, even if it meant facing danger head-on. A confrontation of secrets. Sebastian rose slowly from his chair, the dim light from the fire casting long shadows across his thin, angular face. He stepped closer, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Lucas, you're just a boy. You don't understand the weight of the legacy you're trying to claim. The House of Ravencliff is no ordinary inheritance." I clenched my fists, holding my ground. "Then explain it to me. Why did my father leave this place? Why did he warn me about you in his letter? What are you hiding?" Sebastian let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Your father was a fool. He ran from responsibility, abandoning his birthright. And now you stand here thinking you can take his place? Do you even realize what you're stepping into?" Before I could respond, he turned sharply and walked toward the large, dusty bookshelf that lined the far wall. With a flick of his hand, he pulled one of the books, and I heard a faint click. The bookshelf creaked open, revealing a hidden passageway behind it. "Follow me," Sebastian said, his tone commanding. "A hidden passage." I hesitated for a moment, but knew I had no choice. If I wanted answers, I had to follow him. The passageway was narrow and damp, lit only by a single torch Sebastian carried. The walls were made of rough stone, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. As we walked deeper into the passage, I noticed markings etched into the walls, strange symbols and patterns I didn't recognize. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Sebastian didn't turn back. "This is the true heart of Ravencliff," he said. "A place your father was too weak to embrace." After what felt like an eternity, we reached a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron. Sebastian pulled out a key from his coat and unlocked it. The door creaked open, revealing a large, circular room lit by flickering candles. At the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and on it lay an old, ornate chest, the chest of secrets. Sebastian motioned toward the chest. "This is what your father ran from. This is the truth he wanted to shield you from." I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The chest was intricately carved with symbols similar to those on the walls of the passage. Its edges were adorned with gold trim, though much of it had tarnished over time. "What's inside?" I asked. Sebastian smirked. "Go ahead. Open it." With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside, I found bundles of documents, old maps, and what appeared to be financial ledgers. But among them was something far more sinister, a dagger with a jeweled hilt, dried blood still staining its blade. My stomach turned as I realized what I was holding. "What? What is this?" I stammered. Sebastian's voice was low and steady. "That dagger, Lucas, is the key to this family's power. It has taken lives, secured alliances, eliminated enemies, and ensured the survival of the House of Ravencliff. Your father refused to wield it. He refused to do what was necessary. That's why he left." I dropped the dagger onto the table, horrified. "You're telling me my father left because you wanted him to kill someone?" Sebastian's expression darkened. "It wasn't just about killing, boy. It was about loyalty. Your father chose to walk away from his duty, leaving me to bear the weight of this family alone, and now here you are trying to take his place." The plot unfolds. My mind was racing, trying to process what Sebastian was telling me. I backed away from the chest, shaking my head. "You're insane," I said. "This isn't loyalty, it's madness. My father was right to leave. And if you think I'm going to follow in your footsteps, you're wrong." Sebastian laughed again, this time louder and more menacing. "You think you have a choice, Lucas? You've already stepped into this world. Do you really think anyone will let you walk away now? There are others who want this castle, this power. Do you think they'll let some naive boy inherit it without a fight?" I glared at him, my fear quickly turning into anger. "I don't care about the castle or your so-called legacy. I just want to know the truth about my father." Sebastian's expression softened slightly, but there was still a hint of malice in his eyes. Your father was a coward, Lucas. He ran from responsibility, and in doing so he made enemies. Enemies who would have killed him if I hadn't stepped in. I protected him. And how did he repay me? By abandoning everything. A deadly trap. Before I could respond, Sebastian's demeanor shifted. He walked toward the doorway and placed his hand on the wall, pulling a lever hidden in the stone. The sound of gears turning echoed through the passage. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice rising. Sebastian smirked. "Let's see if you're truly your father's son. If you want to prove yourself, you'll have to survive what's coming next." The floor beneath me suddenly shifted, and I realized too late what was happening. A trap door opened, and I fell into darkness. The dungeon. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of my lungs. The space I landed in was cold and damp, with water dripping from the ceiling. It was a dungeon, and I wasn't alone. Shadows moved in the corners, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw figures emerging from the darkness. Prisoners, their faces hollow and gaunt. One of them, a young man with piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. "You must be the boy Sebastian's been talking about," he said, his voice calm but wary. "Who are you?" I asked, struggling to stand. "Name's Archer," he said. "And if you want to survive down here, you'd better stick with me, a new ally." Archer quickly explained that Sebastian had been using the dungeon to imprison anyone who threatened his claim to Ravencliff. Some of the prisoners had been there for years, forgotten by the outside world. "Sebastian's a dangerous man," Archer said, "but if we work together, we might have a chance to escape and bring him down for good." I hesitated. Trusting someone in this situation felt risky, but what choice did I have? Sebastian had shown his true colors, and it was clear that if I stayed here, I wouldn't survive for long. "All right," I said, meeting Archer's gaze. "Let's get out of here." Archer grinned. "Good, but be warned. Sebastian doesn't let anyone leave Ravencliff alive." As we began to plan our escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Sebastian's dark plot had been revealed, but the fight for survival and the truth was far from over. Part 5. Adventures at Sea. The cold sea air bit into my skin as I stood on the deck of the ship, my wrists bound tightly with rough rope. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting a blood-red glow over the water. I didn't know it yet, but my journey aboard the Stormbringer would change everything. Captured on the Stormbringer. When I awoke after falling unconscious in the dungeon, I found myself aboard a ship. My hands were tied, my head throbbed, and the smell of salt water and damp wood filled my nose. Around me, sailors moved about, shouting orders and adjusting the sails as the ship creaked and groaned beneath their feet. A gruff voice snapped me out of my daze. "Look who's finally awake." I looked up to see a tall, burly man standing over me. His face was weathered by years at sea, and his left eye was covered by a black patch. He leaned down, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You must be the boy Sebastian sent us," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Welcome aboard the Stormbringer. I'm Captain Magnus, and you're now my guest." "Guest?" I spat, struggling against the ropes. "More like prisoner." Magnus laughed, a deep, hollow sound. "Call it what you like, boy. But you should know Sebastian paid me handsomely to get rid of you. You'll fetch a fine price in America." My blood ran cold. "America?" I repeated, panic rising in my chest. "You can't do this," Magnus smirked. "Oh, I can, and I will. Now, if you don't want to make things harder for yourself, you'll keep your mouth shut and do as you're told." Life below deck. I was thrown into the ship's hold, a dark and cramped space filled with the smell of rot and seawater. Around me were barrels of supplies, rusted chains hanging from the walls, and a few other prisoners, their faces gaunt and tired. Among them was a man who stood out immediately, a wiry figure with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. He looked up as I was pushed into the hold and smirked. "New blood," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "What's your story, kid?" "I'm Lucas," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Sebastian, my uncle, sent me here." "And you?" He chuckled. "Name's Archer. Let's just say Magnus and I don't see eye to eye. That's why I'm down here." "What do you mean?" I asked, sitting down beside him. "I used to be part of the crew," Archer explained, "until I realized Magnus was nothing more than a snake. He deals in people, sells them to the highest bidder. When I spoke out, this is where I ended up." I felt a surge of anger. "We can't just sit here. We have to stop him." Archer raised an eyebrow. "We? You've got spirit, kid, but you're out of your depth. Magnus has the crew in his pocket. No one dares stand up to him." I clenched my fists. "Then we'll find a way. There has to be something we can do. An unlikely alliance." Over the next few days, Archer and I talked in hushed whispers, planning and observing the crew. He taught me how to navigate the hold without drawing attention and shared stories of life at sea, stories of betrayal, survival, and rebellion. One night, as the ship rocked gently on the waves, Archer leaned closer to me. "I've been thinking, Lucas, there's a way off this ship, but it's risky." "What is it?" I asked eagerly. "The crew hates Magnus," Archer said. "They follow him out of fear, not loyalty. If we can convince them to turn against him, we might stand a chance." I nodded. "What do we need to do?" Archer smirked. "First, we need weapons. Then we need to show them that Magnus isn't as untouchable as he thinks." The mutiny. The plan began with a daring act of stealth. Late one night, while the crew was distracted by a storm brewing on the horizon, Archer and I slipped out of the hold. Moving silently through the shadows, we made our way to the weapons. Locker. The door was locked, but Archer, ever resourceful, picked the lock with a thin piece of metal he had hidden in his boot. Inside, we found swords, daggers, and pistols. My hands shook as I picked up a dagger, the weight of it unfamiliar but comforting. "Are you ready for this?" Archer asked, his eyes serious. "I don't have a choice," I replied. "I won't let Magnus win." The next morning, as the sun rose over the churning sea, the mutiny began. Archer and I rallied the crew, whispering our plan to those who would listen. Many of them were eager to see Magnus overthrown, and by midday, tensions on the ship were at a boiling point. When Magnus appeared, on deck barking orders, Archer stepped forward. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Your reign ends here, Magnus!" The captain turned, his face twisted with fury. "You dare challenge me?" he roared. "You'll regret this, Archer." The battle on deck. The deck erupted into chaos as swords clashed and shouts filled the air. I stayed close to Archer, using the dagger to defend myself as Magnus's loyalists fought to protect him. The sea roared beneath us, waves crashing against the hull as if mirroring the chaos above. At one point, I found myself face to face with Magnus. His sheer size and strength were overwhelming, and I barely managed to dodge his swings. Just as he raised his sword to strike, Archer intervened, blocking the blow and shoving Magnus backward. "You're finished, Magnus!" Archer growled. His blade pressed against the captain's throat. Magnus laughed, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. "You think you've won? Look around you!" I turned to see the storm that had been brewing all day now unleashed in full force. Lightning split the sky and the ship lurched violently as waves crashed over the sides, the storm and the crash. The mutiny was interrupted as the storm took control of the ship. Crew members scrambled to secure the sails, but it was too late. The Stormbringer was at the mercy of the sea. Archer grabbed my arm. "We have to get to the lifeboats." As we ran across the slick deck, I saw Magnus standing at the helm, gripping the wheel with a manic gleam in his eyes. "If I go down," he shouted, "you all go down with me." Before we could stop him, the ship struck a hidden reef. The sound of wood splintering was deafening, and the Stormbringer began to break apart. "Jump!" Archer shouted, pushing me toward the edge of the ship. I hesitated for only a moment before leaping into the freezing water. Lost at sea! The waves tossed me around like a rag doll, and I struggled to keep my head above water. Debris from the ship floated around me, and I clung to a piece of wood, coughing and gasping for air. I searched desperately for Archer, but saw no sign of him. The last thing I remembered before the darkness consumed me was the faint outline of land on the horizon. Part 6. The Rebellion. My body was cold, drenched from the sea, and my head throbbed as I lay on the rocky shore. The Stormbringer was gone, splintered into pieces by the raging storm. But the battle wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. Awakening on the shore. I opened my eyes to the pale light of dawn breaking over the horizon. The waves lapped gently at the shore, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the storm. I coughed, spitting out seawater, and sat up slowly. My muscles ached, my clothes were torn, and my mind was clouded with questions. The last thing I remembered was Archer's voice shouting at me to jump. I scanned the shoreline, my heart sinking as I saw bits of wood and torn sails scattered along the beach. The wreckage of the Stormbringer was all that remained. My chest tightened as I called out hoarsely into the wind. "Archer, are you there? Can you hear me?" Silence. Only the sound of the sea answered me, a faint hope. I struggled to my feet, limping along the shore as I searched for any sign of life. It wasn't long before I spotted footprints in the sand. My heart raced. Someone else had survived. I followed the trail until I came upon a small cave nestled in the rocks. Inside, I saw a figure slumped against the wall, coughing violently. It was Archer. "Archer!" I shouted, rushing to his side. His face was pale, and his breathing was labored, but his eyes flickered open at the sound of my voice. "Lucas," he croaked, a weak smile tugging at his lips. "Still alive, huh? Guess you're tougher than you look." Relief washed over me as I helped him sit up. "We made it," I said. "But the ship, it's gone." Archer nodded grimly. "And Magnus?" I shook my head. "I didn't see him. He could still be out there, or he might have gone down with the ship. The new plan. After resting for a few hours, Archer regained some of his strength. As we sat around a small fire he had managed to build, he turned to me with a determined, "Look, Lucas, Magnus might be gone, but his men are still out there. If they find us first, we're dead. We need to act before they regroup." "What do you mean?" I asked. Archer leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with resolve. "We're going to take the fight to them. This rebellion isn't over until every one of Magnus's loyalists is dealt with, and the rest of the crew is freed from his shadow." I hesitated. "But we don't have weapons, and we're outnumbered." Archer grinned. "We've got the element of surprise, and I've got a few tricks up my sleeve. Gathering allies." Over the next 2 days, Archer and I scouted the coastline, searching for other survivors. We found a handful of crew members who had washed ashore, men who had long despised Magnus, but had been too afraid to act against him. Among them was a young sailor named Owen, who had worked in the galley, and an older man called Ronan, who had once been a navigator. "Magnus is gone," Archer told them, his voice firm and inspiring. "This is our chance to take back our freedom. Are you with us?" The men exchanged uncertain glances before Owen spoke up. "We've followed Magnus for too long. If you're leading this, Archer, I'm in." One by one, the others agreed. Our small band of rebels was forming, and though we were few, we were united by a shared hatred for the tyranny of Magnus. The first strike. Our first goal was simple: reclaim what remained of the ship's weapons. We knew that some of Magnus's loyalists had salvaged supplies from the wreck and set up a makeshift camp further inland. If we could take them by surprise, we'd have a chance to arm ourselves. Under the cover of darkness, we approached the camp. There were 6 men sitting around a fire, laughing and drinking from salvaged barrels of rum. The weapons, swords, pistols, and daggers were piled carelessly. To one side, Archer turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll hit them fast and hard. Lucas, stay behind me. If things go south, you run." I nodded, gripping the small dagger I had found earlier. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. At Archer's signal, we sprang into action. He and Ronan charged the camp, shouting to create confusion. Owen and I flanked them, cutting off any chance of escape. The fight was chaotic. Shouts, clashing steel, and the crack of gunfire filled the night. I barely managed to defend myself, but Archer fought with the precision of someone who had spent his life in battle. In the end, we emerged victorious. The Loyalists were subdued, and the weapons were ours. a growing rebellion. With the weapons secured, our group began to grow. Word spread quickly among the remaining survivors of the Stormbringer. Sailors who had once feared Magnus now saw an opportunity to break free from his tyranny. By the end of the week, our small band of rebels had grown to nearly 20 men. Archer, ever the strategist, devised a plan to retake control of the remaining loyalists. "They're holed up in a fort further inland," he explained, drawing a rough map in the dirt. "If we can cut off their supplies and force them out, we'll have the upper hand." The final battle, the night of the attack, was tense. The Loyalists had fortified their position, but they were unprepared for the ferocity of our assault. Under the cover of darkness, we surrounded the fort, cutting off their escape routes. As the signal was given, we stormed the gates. The battle was brutal. I found myself face to face with men twice my size, fighting for survival. The skills I had learned from Archer kept me alive, but the fear never left me. At one point, I saw Owen fall, a sword slicing across his leg. I rushed to his side, dragging him to safety before rejoining the fight. Archer, as always, was in the thick of it. His blade moved with deadly precision, cutting down anyone who stood in his way. "Push forward!" he shouted, rallying our men. "This is our moment!" By dawn, the fort was ours. The Loyalists who survived surrendered, their spirits broken. The rebellion had succeeded, a bitter victory. As we stood on the blood-soaked ground, a strange silence fell over the group. The cost of our victory was heavy. Several of our men had fallen, and others were gravely injured. But for the first time, we were free. Archer placed a hand on my shoulder, his expression solemn. "You did well, Lucas. Your father would be proud." I nodded, though the weight of everything we had endured was almost too much to bear. "What happens now?" I asked. Archer looked out toward the horizon, his eyes distant. "Now we rebuild. And we make sure no one like Magnus ever rises to power again. To be continued." Though the rebellion was over, I knew my journey was far from complete. The fight for justice and the truth about my family was only just beginning. Part 7. Survival on the Island. I thought the rebellion was the hardest thing I'd face, but the sea had other plans for me. The next chapter of my journey was one of isolation, survival, and an island that seemed intent on breaking me. Yet, it was here that I learned what I was truly made of. Lost and alone. The waves crashed violently against the shore as I lay on the rocky beach, coughing up seawater. The rebellion had ended in victory, But now I was cast adrift once again. This time, not on the sea, but on an island I didn't recognize. I sat up slowly, my body aching from the journey. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. All around me was an endless expanse of water, and behind me rose a dense, forbidding jungle. "Where am I?" I muttered, my voice hoarse. I looked around, hoping to see Archer or any sign of the crew, but the beach was empty. I was alone, exploring the unknown. As night fell, the air grew colder, and the realization of my isolation hit me hard. I had no food, no shelter, and no idea what dangers the island held. My first priority was to find a safe place to rest. I stumbled into the jungle, pushing past thick vegetation, my ears straining to catch any sound that might signal danger. After what felt like hours, I came across a small clearing. A cluster of rocks formed a natural shelter, shielding me from the wind. Exhausted, I curled up beneath them, using my tattered jacket for warmth. The jungle came alive with the sounds of insects and distant animal cries. And though fear gnawed at the edges of my mind, exhaustion pulled me into a restless sleep. The first morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping overhead and the sun filtering through the trees. My body was stiff, my throat dry, and my stomach growled with hunger. Survival instincts kicked in as I stood and assessed my surroundings. Food, water, shelter, I said to myself, repeating the lessons Victor had once taught me during our hunting trips near my childhood home. Start with water. I wandered through the jungle, following the faint sound of running water until I came across a small stream. The water was clear and cool, and I drank deeply, the relief instant and overwhelming. After quenching my thirst, I turned my attention to finding food, foraging, and learning. The jungle was alive with potential dangers and resources. I found berries on a nearby bush, but their unfamiliar appearance made me hesitate. Were they safe to eat? I decided to test them the way Victor had taught me, rubbing a small amount on my skin and waiting for a reaction. When nothing happened, I ate a handful, grateful for even a small respite from the gnawing hunger. As the day wore on, I began to gather other supplies, vines to use as rope, sturdy branches for tools, and large leaves to create a better shelter. By nightfall, I had improved my rocky hideout, weaving branches and leaves into a crude barrier to keep out the wind and any curious animals. A harsh reality. Survival on the island wasn't easy. The days were hot, The nights were cold and food was scarce. I quickly realized that the berries I had found wouldn't sustain me for long. I needed protein, meat or fish, using a sharp rock. I fashioned a spear from one of the branches I had collected. It was crude but functional. I spent hours by the stream, practicing my aim, waiting for the chance to catch a fish. When I finally managed to spear one, the rush of triumph was overwhelming. I cooked it over a small fire I had painstakingly built, savoring the warmth and the taste of real food for the first time in days. Strange signs. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice strange things about the island. Paths that seemed too well worn to have been made by animals. Stones arranged in deliberate patterns. Once, I even thought I saw a figure moving through the trees, but when I called out, no one answered. At night, I sometimes heard drums in the distance, a low, rhythmic beat that sent shivers down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew I wasn't alone on the island. An unexpected encounter. One morning, as I was foraging near the edge of the jungle, I heard the snap of a twig behind me. I spun around, my spear at the ready, and came face to face with a man. He was tall and lean, his skin weathered by the sun. His clothes were tattered, and he carried a machete at his side. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. Finally, he spoke. "You're not from here," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. I lowered my spear cautiously. "No," I replied. "I was shipwrecked. Who are you?" He hesitated before answering. "Name's Elias. I've been on this island for 3 years." Elias's story. Over the next few days, Elias and I formed a fragile alliance. He was a former sailor who had been marooned on the island after a mutiny aboard his ship. Like me, he had struggled to survive, but over time he had learned the island's secrets. "This place isn't just any island," Elias told me one night as we sat by the fire. "There's something strange about it. People come here, but they don't leave." His words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked. Elias looked into the flames, his expression grim. "There are others here, a tribe. They're not hostile, but they keep to themselves. And then there's the island itself. It feels alive, like it's watching us." The turning point. With Elias's guidance, I learned how to navigate the island more effectively. He showed me which plants were safe to eat, where to find fresh water, and how to avoid the areas controlled by the mysterious tribe. But one day, everything changed. Elias and I were exploring a cave near the island's northern cliffs when we stumbled upon something neither of us expected. A chest. It was old, its wood weathered, and its iron fittings rusted. When we pried it open, we found gold coins, maps, and strange artifacts that looked centuries old. "This explains a lot," Elias muttered. "This island was a pirate's haven. That's why there's so much history and so much danger." The maps hinted at a way off the island, showing routes to nearby shipping lanes. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. But as we turned to leave the cave, we heard voices outside, low, guttural voices speaking a language I didn't understand. Elias grabbed my arm, his expression serious. "The tribe," he whispered. "They've found us." Part 8. Allies and Revelations. I thought surviving the island would be my greatest challenge, but the truth was far more complicated. What began as a struggle for survival quickly turned into a journey of uncovering hidden truths, finding unexpected allies, and learning that nothing and no one was as it seemed. The tribe revealed. Elias and I froze as the voices outside the cave grew louder. My heart raced, and my grip tightened on the crude spear I had been carrying. The tribe Elias had spoken about wasn't just a rumor. They were real, and they were close. Elias motioned for me to stay quiet. He extinguished the small torch we had been using, plunging the cave into darkness. We waited, barely breathing, as footsteps approached the entrance. "They're looking for us," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. "If they find the chest—" He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. The chest we had discovered, filled with gold coins, maps, and artifacts, must have been important to them. If they found us with it, we were as good as dead, an unlikely truce. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment I thought we were safe. But then a voice echoed through the cave, a deep, commanding tone speaking in a language I didn't recognize. A figure stepped into the entrance, silhouetted against the daylight. He was tall and imposing, with a spear in one hand and intricate markings painted across his chest and face. Before I could react, Elias stepped forward, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Wait!" he called out, switching to the language. They spoke. I stared at him in shock. "You can speak their language?" I whispered. He shot me a quick glance. "I've had time to learn." The tribesman lowered his spear slightly, listening as Elias spoke rapidly. I couldn't understand the words, but the tension in the air was palpable. After a few moments, the tribesman gestured for us to follow him. "What's happening?" I asked. "We're going to their village." Elias said grimly. If we resist, they'll kill us. But if we cooperate, they might let us live. The village of the tribe. The walk to the village was tense and silent. The jungle seemed to grow darker as we moved deeper into it, the thick canopy overhead blocking out the sun. When we finally emerged into a clearing, I was struck by what I saw. The village was larger than I had expected, with dozens of thatched huts arranged in a circular pattern. Smoke rose from fires scattered throughout the settlement, and people moved about with purpose. Men, women, and children stopped to stare as we were led through the center of the village. Their gazes were not hostile, but curious and wary. At the center of the village stood a large wooden structure, more elaborate than the surrounding huts. The tribesman leading us gestured for us to enter. Inside, an older man sat on a carved wooden throne, flanked by two warriors. He wore a crown of feathers and beads, and his piercing eyes seemed to see straight through me. The tribal leader. Elias bowed slightly, speaking in their language once again. The leader listened, his expression unreadable, before turning his gaze. To me, he said something, and Elias translated. He wants to know why you're here, Elias said. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Tell him, we were shipwrecked. We didn't mean to disturb them. Elias relayed the message, and the leader nodded slowly. He spoke again, his voice firm but calm. He says the island has been their home for generations, Elias translated. Outsiders have always brought trouble, and they want to know if we're here to do the same. No, I said quickly. We just want to survive and leave. That's all. The leader seemed to consider this, then gestured to one of the warriors. A moment later, the chest we had found was brought into the room and placed at his feet. My stomach dropped. The leader spoke again, his tone sharper this time. He says this chest belongs to his people, Elias explained. It's a part of their history, stolen by pirates long ago. He wants to know how we found it and what we plan to do with it. The revelation. I glanced at Elias, unsure of what to say. But before I could speak, the leader raised his hand, silencing the room. He gestured to one of the warriors, who stepped forward carrying a rolled-up map. The leader unrolled it, revealing an intricate drawing of the island and the surrounding waters. My eyes widened as I recognized the markings. Shipping routes, hidden coves, and even a symbol that looked like the crest of my family's house. What is this? I asked. Elias's face darkened. It's a map of the island's history. Look, your family's crest. That means... The leader spoke again, his voice filled with gravity. He says your family was involved with the pirates, Elias translated. They worked together using this island as a base to hide their treasures. But when the pirates betrayed the tribe, your family fled, leaving the island to face the consequences. The words hit me like a blow. That's not possible, I said, shaking my head. My father never mentioned anything about this. Elias gave me a grim look. Maybe he didn't want you to know. A decision to make. The leader stood, his eyes locked on mine. He spoke slowly, and Elias translated. He says the chest and its contents belong to the tribe. If you want to leave this island alive, you must return what is theirs and promise never to come back. I hesitated, my mind racing. The gold and artifacts in the chest could have been my way off the island, my chance to start over. But could I justify keeping them, knowing the history behind them? Elias placed a hand on my shoulder. Lucas, we don't need the chest. If we can earn their trust, they might help us find another way off the island. After a long moment, I nodded. Tell him we'll return everything. We don't want any trouble. Elias translated my words, and the leader's expression softened. He spoke again, and Elias smiled faintly. He says you've made the right choice, and because of that, he's willing to help us. An alliance formed. Over the next few days, Elias and I worked alongside the tribe, learning more about their history and way of life. They showed us how to navigate the island, where to find food, and even shared their knowledge of the sea. In return, we helped them fortify their village and shared what little knowledge we had about the outside world. The leader, whose name was revealed to be Kale, became a surprising ally. Though he remained wary of us, he began to trust us more, as we proved our sincerity. One night, as we sat by the fire, Kale handed me a small carved amulet. It was made of stone, etched with the same symbols I had seen in the cave. "What's this?" I asked. Elias translated Kale's response. "It's a symbol of protection. He says it's for your journey. Wherever it takes you next, this will remind you of the choices you made here." A path forward. With the tribe's help, Elias and I prepared a small boat using materials salvaged from the Stormbringer. As we pushed it into the water, Kale and the other villagers gathered to watch. Though I was relieved to leave the island, a part of me felt a deep sense of gratitude for what I had learned there. As we set sail, I glanced back at the island one last time, the amulet clutched tightly in my hand. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain. The journey wasn't over. There were still truths to uncover about my family, about the island, and about myself. Part 9. The final confrontation at Ravencliff Castle. I thought the island held all the answers I needed, but I was wrong. The real battle wasn't on the treacherous waves or in the depths of the jungle. It was waiting for me at Ravencliff Castle, where dark secrets, betrayal, and unfinished business would finally come to light. The return to Ravencliff. Elias and I sailed for days, navigating the rough waters with nothing but the salvaged map from the island and the stars to guide us. The journey was grueling. Storms battered our small boat and supplies ran low, yet determination kept us going. The truth about Ravencliff Castle, about my family, burned in my mind like a beacon. Finally, one misty morning, the familiar silhouette of the castle appeared on the horizon. My heart clenched at the sight of its crumbling walls and jagged towers. The place had haunted my dreams since I first left it, and now I was returning, not as a frightened boy, but as someone ready to fight for the truth. "This is it," I said, gripping the side of the boat. Elias glanced at the looming structure and nodded. "Are you sure about this? Once we step inside, there's no turning back." "I'm sure," I replied, my voice steady. "Sebastian has answers, and it's time he gives them to me." A cold welcome. As we approached the castle, a light rain began to fall, soaking the overgrown grounds. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of damp earth and decay. Elias and I climbed the uneven steps to the main entrance, where the heavy wooden door loomed before us. I hesitated for a moment, memories of my last encounter with Sebastian flooding my mind. Then, with a deep breath, I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, echoing through the empty halls. The inside of the castle was just as I remembered, dark, cold, and suffocating. Dust coated every surface and cobwebs hung from the ceilings. But something felt different. There was a tension in the air, an unease that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Stay close," I whispered to Elias as we moved deeper into the castle. The encounter with Sebastian. We found Sebastian in the grand hall, seated at the head of a long dining table. He looked older, thinner, and more haggard than when I'd last seen him, but his eyes still burned with the same intensity. "So," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "the boy returns, and you've brought a friend." Elias stepped forward, but I held out a hand to stop him. "This is between me and him," I said. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, smirking. "What do you want, Lucas? Come to claim your inheritance? Or are you just here to whine about how unfair life has been to you?" I clenched my fists anger boiling inside me. I want the truth about my father, about this castle, about everything you've done. Sebastian's smirk faltered. For a moment I saw a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, in his eyes. But then he stood, his expression hardening. Your father was a coward, he said coldly. He couldn't handle the responsibilities of this. Family. He ran, leaving me to pick up the pieces. That's not true, I shot back. I found the letters. I know about the pirates, about the tribe on the island. You betrayed him, didn't you? You were working with the pirates, and when things went wrong, you blamed him. Sebastian's face twisted with anger. You have no idea what you're talking about, he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. Your father betrayed me. He wanted to destroy everything our family had built. No, I said firmly, stepping closer. He wanted to protect me from you. The truth unveiled. Sebastian laughed bitterly. Protect you? Is that what you think? Your father was weak, Lucas. He couldn't handle the weight of this castle's legacy, so he left it to me. Do you think it was easy, holding this place together? The debts, the enemies, the blood on my hands. It was all for this family. I shook my head. It wasn't for the family. It was for your greed, your pride. And now it's over. This castle doesn't belong to you anymore. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. And you think it belongs to you? You're just a child. You don't have what it takes to carry this legacy. Maybe I don't, I said, my voice steady. But I'm not going to let you destroy what's left of it. The fight. Before I could react, Sebastian lunged at me, a knife glinting in his hand. I stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the blade. Elias stepped forward, drawing his machete, but Sebastian barked. Out a warning. Stay out of this or you'll regret it, he snarled. Elias hesitated, his eyes darting to me. Lucas, are you? I've got this, I said, cutting him off. This is my fight. Sebastian attacked again, his movements fast and erratic. I grabbed a broken chair leg from the floor and used it to block his strikes. The sound of wood clashing against metal echoed through the hall. You're just like your father, Sebastian spat, his voice filled with venom. Weak, pathetic, his words fueled my determination. I pushed back harder, using every ounce of strength I had. Finally, I managed to knock the knife from his hand. It clattered to the floor, spinning out of reach. Sebastian stumbled backward, breathing heavily. You think this changes anything? He hissed. Even if you take this castle, you'll never escape the weight of what it represents. Maybe, I said, stepping forward. But at least I'll have the chance to make things right. The resolution. Sebastian collapsed into a chair, defeated. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by exhaustion and resignation. For the first time, he looked old, like a man who had carried too much for too long. "Do what you want," he said, quietly. "Take the castle. Take everything. It won't matter in the end." I turned to Elias, who nodded in silent approval. Together, we bound Sebastian's hands and secured him in one of the castle's many rooms. The fight was over, but the weight of what had happened lingered. A new beginning. In the days that followed, Elias and I began the process of reclaiming Ravencliff Castle. We sent word to the nearby village, gathering people who had once worked for my family. Slowly but surely, the castle began to come alive again. As for Sebastian, I handed him over to the authorities, along with the evidence of his crimes. He didn't protest. Perhaps he knew that his time had finally run out. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, Elias and I stood on the castle's highest tower, looking out at the horizon. "So," Elias said, breaking the silence, "what's next for you, Lucas?" I smiled faintly, holding the small carved amulet Kyle had given me. "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever it is, it'll be on my own terms." Elias clapped me on the back. "You've come a long way, kid. Your father would be proud." As the last rays of sunlight bathed the castle in gold, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. The journey wasn't over, but I was ready for whatever came next. Part 10. The Resolution. The fight was over, but the journey was far from complete. As the dust settled at Ravencliff Castle, I realized that victory wasn't just about defeating Sebastian. It was about rebuilding, healing, and finding my place in the world. A world I barely recognized anymore. Reclaiming Ravencliff Castle. The castle that had once loomed over me like a shadow now stood as a symbol of hope. It was mine now, but it was a shell of what it had once been. Its walls were cracked, its halls silent, and its people scattered. If Ravencliff was to become a home again, there was much work to be done. Elias and I wasted no time. The first step was gathering those who had once served my family. Letters were sent to nearby villages, calling on anyone who remembered the days of my father's rule. Slowly they began to return. Gardeners, cooks, stable hands, and even a few old friends of my father. Their faces lit up with hope when they saw me, and for the first time, I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. The trial of Sebastian. Sebastian's fate was left to the local authorities. The evidence of his crimes, his betrayal of the tribe, his dealings with pirates, and his attempt to sell me to Magnus was overwhelming. The trial was swift, and Sebastian offered no defense. He sat silently as the charges were read, his eyes fixed on the floor. When the verdict was delivered, banishment from the region, he turned to me for the first time. His voice was quiet, but laced with bitterness. You think you've won, Lucas, but this castle will break you, just as it broke. Your father, remember that? I didn't respond. As I watched him being led away, I felt no triumph, only a deep sense of finality. Sebastian was gone, but his words lingered in my mind. Rebuilding the castle and trust. The days turned into weeks as life slowly returned to Ravencliff Castle. The villagers brought supplies and craftsmen arrived to repair the crumbling walls. I worked alongside them, determined to prove that I was more than just a name. I spent my mornings overseeing repairs, my afternoons learning about the estate's finances, and my evenings listening to the stories of those who had known my father. Elias stayed by my side, his steady presence a source of strength. "You're doing good work, Lucas," he said one evening as we stood on the castle's parapet, watching the sun set over the valley. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so," I replied, clutching the amulet Cale had given me. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing. This place has so much history, so much pain." Elias placed a hand on my shoulder. "History is only a burden if you let it be. You have a chance to create something new here, something better. Don't waste." Tuos, a visit from the tribe. One morning, as the repairs were nearing completion, a small group arrived at the castle gates. At their head was Cale, the leader of the tribe from the island. My heart leapt at the sight of him. "Cale!" I called out, hurrying to greet him. "What are you doing here?" He smiled, his presence as commanding as ever. "We came to see if you kept your word," he said, his tone light but his gaze piercing. I led them into the castle, showing them the changes we had made. I explained how we had reclaimed the land, repaired the walls, and started to rebuild the community. Kyle listened silently, nodding occasionally. At the end of the tour, he handed me a small pouch. Inside was a polished stone, similar to the amulet he had given me on the island. "This is a token of trust," he said. "Your family's history with my people is complicated, but I believe you are different. If you ever need our help, you know where to find us." I thanked him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Cale's visit was more than just a gesture. It was a symbol of the bridges I was beginning to rebuild, facing the ghosts of the past. One evening, as I walked through the castle's great hall, I found myself standing before an old portrait of my father. His eyes, so much like mine, seemed to look straight at me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Why did you keep so much hidden?" I felt a pang of sadness as I thought about everything I had learned. The pirates, the betrayal, the secrets my father had tried to protect me from. But as I stood there, I realized that his silence hadn't been out of cowardice. It had been out of love. He had tried to shield me from a world he thought would destroy me. "I understand now," I said softly. "And I'll make sure your sacrifices weren't in vain." A new purpose. With the castle restored and the community thriving, I began to think about the future. Ravencliff Castle wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of resilience, a place where people could come together and rebuild their lives. I started working on plans to open the castle to the surrounding villages, turning it into a hub for trade, education, and refuge. Elias offered his support, helping me draft letters and organize meetings with local leaders. "This is more than just a castle now," he said. "It's a new beginning for you and everyone here," saying goodbye to Elias. One crisp autumn morning, Elias came to me with a solemn expression. "It's time for me to move on," he said. "The sea is calling, and there are still places I need to see." I felt a lump in my throat but nodded. "I don't know how to thank you, Elias. Without you, I wouldn't be standing here." He grinned. "You don't need to thank me, Lucas. You've done more than enough. Just promise me you'll keep fighting for this place, for your family's legacy." We shook hands, and I watched as he walked down the castle steps, his figure disappearing into the morning mist. Though I was sad to see him go, I knew our paths would cross again someday. The road ahead. As the days turned into months, Ravencliff Castle became a beacon of hope. Travelers came seeking refuge, merchants brought goods to trade, and the halls once filled with silence now echoed with laughter and life. I knew the journey wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead, enemies to face, secrets to uncover, but for the first time, I felt ready. Ravencliff was more than just a home now. It was a symbol of everything I had fought for, and I was determined to protect it. Standing on the castle's highest tower, I looked out at the horizon, the amulet Cale had given me clutched in my hand. The wind carried the promise of new adventures, and I couldn't help but smile. "This is just the beginning," I said aloud, "and I'm ready for whatever comes next. The end and a new beginning." Lucas's story at Ravencliff Castle has reached its resolution, but his journey is far from over. With allies forged, enemies defeated, and a new purpose discovered, he steps forward into an uncertain future. stronger, and more determined than ever. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.